The river Avon ran cold and silver beneath the morning mist, its waters carrying the whispered prayers of the monks who knelt within the stone walls of St. Cuthbert's Priory. For 30 years, the priory had stood at the bend of the river, a sanctuary of peace in a land that knew little of it. The bells called the brothers to prayer 7 times a day, and the rhythm of their lives was as steady as the current that flowed past their gates. But on a night when the moon hid behind a veil of cloud, and the river ran darker than any soul could remember, something washed ashore that would change everything. Brother Salen had never left the priory grounds. Not once in his 18 winters. He had been left at the gates as an infant, wrapped in a woolen blanket with nothing but a wooden cross clutched in his tiny fist. Father Aldwin, the prior, had taken him in, raised him in the ways of the Lord, and taught him the sacred art of illuminating manuscripts. Salen's hands were steady and his eyes were sharp, and he could spend hours with a quill, painting the margins of holy texts with vines and flowers and the faces of saints. It was a quiet life, a safe life, a life that had never required him to wonder what lay beyond the walls. But on that night, the night the river brought a secret to his feet, Salen learned that safety was an illusion, and that the world outside was far more complicated than the scriptures had ever taught him. He had not meant to disobey. Father Aldwin had given strict instructions that no one was to leave the priory after Compline, not with the rumors of Viking raids growing louder with each passing week. But Kalen had heard something, a sound that did not belong to the river, or the wind, or the creatures of the forest. It was a groan, low and deep, the sound of something in pain, and something else. A splash, as if something heavy had been dragged from the water onto the bank. He should have gone to Father Aldwin. He knew he should have. But curiosity had always been his quiet sin, the one he confessed more often than any other. So he pulled his woolen cloak tight around his shoulders, slipped through the small gate at the back of the herb garden, and followed the path down to the river. The mist clung to the water like a shroud, and the reeds whispered secrets to the dark. Kalen moved carefully, his bare feet silent on the damp earth, his heart beating a rhythm he did not recognize. And then he saw it, a shape, massive, sprawling, half in the water and half on the bank. A man. But no ordinary man. He was larger than any man Kalen had ever seen, with shoulders that seemed to block out the stars and arms as thick as the oak beams in the priory's refectory. His hair was the color of winter wheat, long and tangled and matted with something dark that could only be blood. His face was half submerged in the shallows, and for a moment Kalen thought he was dead. But then the man groaned again, and one hand, a hand so large it could have crushed Kalen's skull like an egg, twitched in the mud. And in that hand, clutched so tightly that the knuckles were white beneath the blood, was a leather pouch. Kalen stood frozen at the edge of the reeds, his breath caught in his throat. Everything he had been taught screamed at him to run. The Vikings were demons. They were the scourge of God, sent to punish the sinful. They burned churches and murdered priests, and carried away innocent souls in chains. To help one was to betray everything he believed, but the man was dying. Kalen could see it in the way his chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven gasps, could see it in the pool of blood that spread into the river like a dark flower, could see it in the fingers that twitched and trembled even as they held fast to whatever was in that pouch. And something, some part of Selen that had never been shaped by the sermons or the scriptures, whispered that letting a man die when he could save him was a sin greater than any other. He stepped forward. The mud was cold between his toes, and the reeds scratched at his legs, but he did not stop. He knelt beside the Viking, his hands shaking, and reached out to touch the man's shoulder. The skin beneath his fingers was burning with fever, and the muscle beneath was hard as stone. The Viking's eyes snapped open, and Kalen nearly screamed. They were the palest blue he had ever seen, like ice in winter sunlight, and they were filled with a pain so raw it seemed to crackle in the air between them. The Viking's lips moved, and a sound came out, a word, or a name in a language Kalen did not understand. Then the eyes closed, and the massive body went still. Kalen sat back on his heels, his heart hammering, his mind racing. He could not carry this man back to the priory. Father Aldwin would never allow it, The brothers would be horrified. They would call it a temptation, a test, a trap laid by the devil himself. But he could not leave him here. The river was rising and the mist was thickening, and by morning the man would be dead. And then Seelan remembered the cave. There was a cave behind the waterfall at the far bend of the river, a place the older brothers had whispered about when he was a novice. They said it had been used by the hermits who first built the priory, before the walls were raised. They said no one went there now, because the path was treacherous and the water was deep. They said it was a place of secrets. Kalen stood, his legs trembling, and looked down at the Viking. The man was easily twice his size, and Seelan was not strong. He had spent his life hunched over manuscripts, not swinging swords. But he had something the Vikings did not have. He knew the river. He knew where the current was gentle and where the bank was firm. He knew how to move through the reeds without leaving a trace. He bent down, hooked his arms under the Viking's massive shoulders, and began to pull. It took him the better part of an hour. The Viking was a dead weight, and the mud seemed to suck at his boots with every step. But Seelan did not stop. He pulled and dragged and heaved, his arms screaming, his breath coming in ragged gasps, until the roar of the waterfall filled his ears and the spray cooled his burning face. The path behind the falls was narrow, a ledge of slick rock that hugged the cliff face, but Seelan had explored it once, years ago, when he was young enough to believe that adventure was not a sin. He remembered a hollow, a chamber carved by centuries of water, dry and sheltered and hidden from the world. He dragged the Viking inside and collapsed beside him, his chest heaving, his muscles trembling with exhaustion. The cave was dark, but the sound of the falls outside was like a heartbeat, steady and constant. Kalen lay there for a long time, listening to the Viking's breath, shallow but there, and wondering what he had just done. The days that followed were the strangest of his life. Kalen returned to the priory before dawn, slipping through the gate as the first light touched the sky, and no one knew he had been gone. He attended the morning prayers with the other brothers, his hands folded, his voice steady, while his mind was somewhere else. And when the day's work began, when the other monks retreated to the scriptorium, or the gardens, or the kitchen, Kalen stole what he could: bread from the pantry, clean cloth from the infirmary, a flask of water from the well, a salve of honey and herbs that Brother Oswin used for wounds. He wrapped them in his cloak and waited until the shadows grew long, and then he went back to the cave. The Viking was alive, but barely. His wound, a deep gash along his ribs, still oozing blood, had begun to fester, and the fever that burned through him made him thrash and mutter in his sleep. Seelan cleaned the wound as best he could, using the river water and the salve, and wrapped it in the clean cloth.
He dribbled water into the Viking's mouth, a drop at a time, and wiped the sweat from his brow. He did not know if the man would live. He did not know why he was trying so hard to save him. On the third night, the Viking opened his eyes. They were clearer this time, more focused, and they fixed on Kalen with an intensity that made him want to step back. The Viking's lips moved, and this time Kalen understood one of the words. You. Seelan nodded, his heart pounding. Yes, I found you. In the river. The Viking stared at him for a long moment, and then his gaze dropped to the leather pouch that still lay clutched in his hand, now crusted with dried blood. He seemed to be measuring something, weighing something. When he looked back at Seelan, there was something in his eyes that might have been suspicion, or might have been something else entirely. Name, the Viking said, the word rough and strange on his tongue. Seelan, he answered. Brother Seelan, what is your name? The Viking's jaw tightened, and for a moment Kalen thought he would not answer. But then he said, Torben. That was the beginning. Each night Seelan returned to the cave, bringing what food and supplies he could steal, and each night Torben grew a little stronger. The wound began to close, the fever faded, and the massive Viking who had been half dead on the riverbank began to sit up, to move, to speak. His Saxon was halting at first, a handful of words he had picked up from raids and trading, but Seelan was patient, and they had nothing but time. They learned each other's language in the dark of the cave, the waterfall roaring beyond the entrance, their voices low and careful. Torben told him nothing about the leather pouch at first. Salen did not ask. But he saw the way Torben slept with it pressed against his chest, the way his fingers tightened around it whenever he heard a sound outside the cave. It was a secret, Salen knew, and secrets had a weight. He carried enough of his own now to understand. On the 7th night, Torben told him. They were sitting at the mouth of the cave, watching the moonlight fracture through the waterfall, and Torben's voice was low and rough. "You want to know what I carry," he said. It was not a question. Salen hesitated, then nodded. "You almost died for it." Torben looked down at the pouch in his hands, and for a moment his face was unreadable. "This is called the Swan's Bone," he said. "My people believe it was given to the first chieftain by a spirit of the sea. It shows the way to a land in the west across the great water, where there is no war, where the fields are green all year and the winters are short." He looked up at Selen, and his eyes were ancient. "My people are dying, Brother Kalen. The land we have is cold and thin, and the winters are getting longer. We raid because we must, because our children go hungry, because the old ways are failing. But there are those among us who believe we should stop raiding, who believe we should find this land in the west and build something new." He held up the pouch, and for the first time Selen saw what was inside. A bone, white and smooth, carved with runes that seemed to shift in the firelight. It was small enough to fit in the palm of a hand, but it seemed to hold the weight of the world. "This was supposed to lead us there," Torben said. "I was chosen to carry it, to find the path, to bring my people home. But Jarl Skade, he leads the war faction. He wants to destroy the bone. He wants to keep raiding, keep killing, keep our people trapped in the old ways. He found out what I carried, and he hunted me. I escaped his men, but they wounded me, and I fell into the river. I thought I would drown. I thought the bone would be lost, and then you found me." Kalen stared at the bone, his mind spinning. He had been raised on stories of Viking savagery, of pagan demons who worshipped false gods and burned churches for sport. But the man sitting beside him was not a demon. He was a man who carried the hope of his people in his hands, a man who had nearly died for the chance to end the wars that had terrorized Kalen's homeland for a generation. "Why are you telling me this?" Salen asked. Torben looked at him, and something in his face softened. "Because you saved my life, because you could have let me die, or turned me over to your priests and you did not, because I need to know if I can trust you with something more than my life." "What more is there?" Torben held out the pouch. "If I die, this must not fall into Skade's hands. If I die, someone must carry it west, someone who believes there is another way." Kalen stared at the pouch, his hands trembling. "I am a monk. I have never been beyond these walls. I do not know how to sail or fight or survive in the wilderness. I am not the person you need." "You are the person I have," Torben said simply, "and you are braver than you know." The weeks that followed were a test of everything Kalen had ever believed. He continued to steal supplies, continued to tend Torben's wound, continued to teach him Saxon and learn his Norse in return. But the weight of the secret was crushing him. He missed prayers, made excuses, withdrew from the other brothers. Father Aldwin's eyes followed him with a suspicion that made his stomach twist. And then one evening, the sky above the priory turned orange. Kalen was in the scriptorium, his quill frozen over a half-finished page, when the bells began to ring. Not the bells for prayer, the bells for alarm. He ran to the window and saw them. Ships. Long ships with dragon prows cutting up the river like knives through silk. They were not Torben's people. Torben had told him about the war faction, about Skade's fleet, about the warriors who would stop at nothing to find the Swan's Bone. And now they were here. The priory erupted into chaos. The brothers ran through the cloisters, their faces white with terror, clutching what few valuables they could carry. Father Aldwin stood at the gate, his voice rising above the panic, calling for order. But there was no order. The Vikings were already ashore, their torches lighting the dusk, their war cries splitting the night. Salen ran. He ran through the herb garden, through the small gate, down the path to the river. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs screamed, and when he reached the waterfall, he plunged through the spray and into the cave. Torben was standing at the entrance, his hand on the leather pouch, his face set in grim lines. He had heard the bells. He had seen the smoke. They came for you, Salen gasped. For the bone. Torben nodded. Skada, he must have followed my trail. You have to go. You have to take the bone and go west like you planned. Torben looked at him, and there was something in his eyes that Salen had not seen before, something that looked almost like grief. I cannot go without you. Salen stared at him. What? If I leave, Skade will burn the priory. He will kill your brothers. He will search every inch of this land until he finds the bone or finds me. But if you come with me, if he sees that the bone is gone, that I have taken it away, he will have no reason to stay. Torben stepped forward, gripping Kaelin's shoulders with hands that trembled. I am asking you to leave everything. Your home, your brothers, your God. I am asking you to come with me into a world you have never seen, toward a future you cannot imagine. I am asking you to trust me. Kaelin's mind was a storm. The priory was burning. His brothers were in danger. Everything he had ever known was crumbling around him. And the man who had asked him to give it all up was the same man he had pulled from the river, the same man whose language he had learned in the dark, the same man who had shown him that the world was not divided simply into saints and sinners, friends and enemies, good and evil.
He thought of Father Aldwin, who had raised him with kindness and certainty. He thought of the scriptorium where he had spent his days painting saints and angels on pages that would outlast him. He thought of the river and the mist and the moment he had chosen to kneel beside a dying Viking instead of running away. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that his choice had already been made. It had been made the night he stepped through the gate. I will come, Kaelin said, but first, I need to do something. He ran back to the priory. The flames were climbing the walls now, and the smoke was thick in the air, but he knew where he was going. He found Father Aldwin in the chapel, kneeling before the altar, his hands clasped in prayer. The old man's face was streaked with tears, but when he looked up and saw Selen, something in his eyes softened. You are not here to hide, Aldwin said. It was not a question. Kaelin knelt beside him. Father, I have done something. I have been hiding a Viking, the one they are looking for. He has something they want, something that could end the raids forever. I am going with him. I am going to help him take it west. Aldwin stared at him, and for a long moment, Selen thought he would rage, would condemn, would call him a traitor and a fool. But the old monk only bowed his head. I knew, he said quietly. I knew you were hiding something. I saw it in your eyes, in the way you moved, in the supplies that went missing. I told myself it was a test, a temptation that you would overcome. But I see now that it was not a test for you. It was a test for me. Father, Aldwin raised a hand, silencing him. I have spent my life teaching you that the world is simple, that the righteous are saved and the wicked are damned, that our walls keep out the darkness. But I was wrong. The darkness is not out there. He gestured toward the burning priory. It is in the hearts of men who would burn a house of God for a piece of bone. And the light is not in our walls. It is in the heart of a boy who would risk everything to save a stranger. He gripped Kaelin's hands, and his voice was fierce. Go. Go with him. Carry that light wherever it takes you, and know that you are not forsaken. You are called. Kaelin pressed his forehead to Aldwin's hands, feeling the tears on his own face, and then he stood. He ran back through the burning cloisters, through the herb garden, through the gate that had been his boundary for 18 years. He ran to the river, to the waterfall, to the man who was waiting with a bone that held the hope of a people in a future that was not yet written. Torben was standing at the mouth of the cave, the pouch clutched to his chest, his face lit by the distant flames. When he saw Lyn, something in his expression broke open, and he stepped forward and caught Talon in his arms. The embrace was fierce, almost crushing, and Salen felt the heat of Torben's body, the strength of his arms, the steady beat of his heart against his own chest. I thought you would not come back, Torben said, his voice rough. I almost did not, Kaelin admitted, but I have something to tell you. Father Aldwin knew. He knew about you, about everything, and he told me to go. Torben pulled back, his mismatched eyes searching Kaelin's face. Your priest. He gave you his blessing. Kaelin nodded. He said I was cold. Torben stared at him for a long moment, And then he did something Salen had never seen him do. He smiled. It was not the wolfish smile of a warrior, but something softer, something that made his scarred face look almost young. Then let us answer that call. They left the cave together, slipping into the river and letting the current carry them downstream. Behind them, the priory burned, the flames painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Ahead of them, the river widened, the banks grew wild, and the sea was waiting. Salen had never seen the sea. He had only heard stories of it, vast and endless, a desert of water that stretched to the edge of the world. But Torbern had promised to show him. Torbern had promised to teach him to sail, to navigate by the stars, to find the land in the west where there was no war. They traveled for 3 days down the river, moving at night, hiding in the reeds by day. Torbern's wound had healed enough for him to move, but he was still weak, and Salen found himself taking the lead, finding the paths, keeping them hidden. The monk who had never left his walls was now guiding a Viking through the wilderness, and the strangest part was that he was not afraid. He was not afraid of the dark, or the river, or the soldiers who searched the banks for signs of them. He was not even afraid of the future, vast and unknowable as it was, because for the first time in his life, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. On the 3rd night, they reached the coast. Kalen stood on a bluff overlooking the sea, and his breath caught in his throat. The stars reflected on the water like scattered diamonds, and the waves whispered against the shore in a language he did not know but somehow understood. The sea was not empty. It was full of possibility. It was a door that had been waiting for him to open it. Torbern came to stand beside him, and Salen felt the warmth of his presence, the solid weight of him in the darkness. Torbern reached out and took his hand, and Salen did not pull away. The Viking's palm was rough and scarred, a warrior's hand, but his grip was gentle. "There is a fishing village to the north," Torbern said. "They are not aligned with Skarder. They will give us a boat, supplies, and from there we sail west." Salen looked at him, at the moonlight silvering his hair, at the scar that crossed his face like a river on a map. "Do you really believe we will find it? The land in the west?" Torbern was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I believe that we must try. I believe that my people deserve a chance to live without war. And I believe that you were brought to me for a reason, Brother Salen." He turned to face Kalen, and in the starlight his eyes were the color of the sea. "The swan's bone was supposed to lead us to a new land. But perhaps it led me to something else first. Perhaps it led me to you." Sealan's heart was beating so hard he was sure Torbern could feel it through their joined hands. He thought of the priory, of the scriptorium, of the walls that had kept him safe and small for 18 years. He thought of Father Oldwin, kneeling in the burning chapel telling him that he was cold. And he thought of the river, and the mist, and the moment he had chosen to kneel beside a dying Viking instead of running away. That choice had brought him here, to the edge of the world, with a man who had shown him that faith was not about walls and certainty, but about stepping into the unknown with open hands. "I have never believed in your gods," Salen said quietly, "and I do not know if I will ever stop believing in mine, but I believe in you. I believe that there is another way, and I believe that we can find it together." Torbern's hand tightened around his, and his voice when he spoke was rough with something that might have been emotion. "That is enough. That is more than enough." They stood there on the bluff looking out at the sea, and the stars wheeled overhead, and the waves whispered their secrets to the shore. Behind them, the land of Sealan's birth lay in ashes. Before them, a world of possibility waited to be discovered. And between them, a bone no larger than a man's hand held the hope of a future that had not yet been written. Torbern turned to him, and in the moonlight, Sealan saw something in his eyes that he had never seen before. Not the suspicion of a wounded warrior, not the determination of a man on a mission. Something softer, something that made his breath catch and his heart stutter in his chest.
"Kalen," Torbern said, and his voice was low, barely more than a whisper. "What you have done for me, what you have risked, there are no words in any language to thank you. But I need you to know something. I need you to know that when I fell into that river, I was ready to die. I had given up. The bone, my mission, my people, it all seemed like dust in my hands, and then you found me. You pulled me from the water and carried me to that cave and saved my life when you had no reason to. And in the days that followed, you gave me something I thought I had lost. Hope. Not because of the bone or the land in the west, but because of you. Because of the way you look at the world, as if it is still full of goodness. Because of the way you refused to let me die, even though everything you had ever been taught told you to run. He stepped closer, and Salen felt the heat of him, the solid presence that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. Torben's hand came up to cup his face, rough fingers tracing the line of his jaw with a gentleness that seemed impossible from hands that had wielded axes and swords. I do not know what waits for us in the west, Torben said. I do not know if we will find the land of my people's dreams, or if we will sail into nothing and be lost. But I know that I do not want to face it without you. I know that whatever comes, I want you beside me, not as a monk, not as a guide, not as a brother, as something more, something I have no name for yet, but that I feel here. He pressed his free hand to his chest, over his heart. I feel it every time you look at me, every time you say my name, every time you choose to stay. Kaelin's breath was coming in shallow gasps, his heart a wild thing in his chest. He had spent his life believing that love was for God alone, that the affections of the flesh were temptations to be resisted. But standing here, on the edge of the world, with Torben's hand on his face and the sea stretching out before them, he understood that there were different kinds of devotion. That some prayers were spoken with the body, and some altars were made of skin and bone, and the quiet spaces between two people who had chosen each other against all odds. I have never, Talon started, his voice catching. I do not know how to be anything other than what I have been. I have never touched another person this way. I have never wanted to. But you want to now? Torben's voice was soft, careful, as if he were handling something precious. Selen looked into his eyes at the scar that bisected his face, at the pale blue than the first thing he saw when he knelt beside a dying stranger in the reeds, and he nodded. Yes, he said. I want to. Torben's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds, and then he was leaning forward, and his lips were on Kaelin's. The kiss was gentle at first, a question more than an answer, a breath that tasted of salt and the river and something else. Something that Salen had no name for but recognized in his bones. He had never been kissed. He had never imagined being kissed. But now that it was happening, he wondered how he had lived so long without it. Torben's hand slid into his hair, and Selen's fingers found the solid warmth of his shoulders, and the kiss deepened, and the world fell away. There was only the sea and the stars, and the two of them standing at the edge of everything they had ever known, choosing each other over certainty, over safety, over the lives they had been given. When they finally pulled apart, Selen's face was wet with tears he had not known he was crying. Torben wiped them away with his thumb, his touch impossibly gentle. I have nothing to offer you, Selen whispered. No dowry, no land, no title. I am nothing. You are everything, Torben said simply. You are the reason I am alive. You are the reason I believe we can find the West. You are the reason I want to live, not just survive. That is more than any king could give me. He took Kaelin's hand again, and they turned together to face the sea. The wind was rising, carrying the promise of dawn on its breath, and somewhere beyond the horizon, a new world was waiting to be discovered. A world without walls, without wars, without the divisions that had kept them apart for centuries. A world they would build together, with nothing but hope and a bone that held the memory of a better future. Selen leaned into Torben's side, feeling the strength of him, the warmth of him, the steady rhythm of his breath. And for the first time in his life, he was not afraid. He was not afraid of the sea, or the journey, or the unknown that lay ahead. He was not afraid of what he had left behind, or what he had become. He was not afraid of the love that was taking root in his chest, growing like a vine that would not be denied. Because he had learned, in the darkness of a cave by a river, that faith was not about certainty. It was about choosing to step forward when the path was dark, about trusting that the hand that reached for you would not let you fall. And he had learned that love was not a sin. It was the most sacred thing in the world, the thing that made the long nights bearable, the thing that gave meaning to the struggle, the thing that turned a bone into a promise and a stranger into a home. They walked down from the bluff together, hand in hand, toward the village where a boat was waiting. And behind them, the river that had carried them to this moment flowed on, its waters silver in the moonlight, whispering the story of a boy who had left his walls behind and found something greater than any kingdom, a purpose, a future, a love that would carry him across the sea to a land that was not yet named, but that they would find together. The swan's bone lay against Torben's chest, warm with the heat of his skin, and Kalen could almost feel its pulse, like the heartbeat of the world. It was not magic, he knew. It was just a bone, carved with runes, a relic of a people who had dreamed of something better. But maybe that was enough. Maybe dreaming of something better was the first step toward making it real. And maybe, just maybe, two men from opposite sides of the world could be the ones to make it happen. The dawn broke over the sea, painting the waves in shades of pink and gold, and Seelan saw it for the first time. The horizon, endless and open, waiting for them to cross it. He squeezed Torben's hand, and Torben squeezed back, and they walked together into the light.